As a university lecturer, I have to impose penalties on student work when that work is submitted late. And I don't like doing it because it's stressful for students. And I also think imposing late penalties is a silly thing to do. And in this video, I'll tell you why. Students who hand in coursework late get an academic penalty. And it's usually 5 marks deducted for every day it's late. That's unless they have a good reason for it being late. And a good reason is usually defined as something outside of their control and unforeseen. But even if they have a good reason, they still get a late penalty if they can't prove that good reason is real. And here is where it gets ugly. In some universities I've worked in, they would require students who submitted work late due to, say, a family bereavement to provide a copy of the death certificate to prove that their relative had, in fact, died. And that gives you an indication of how distrustful universities have become towards their students. And some students give up at that point. They either take the late penalty or they don't bother handing in their work at all. And that's because, in my experience, students are generally very reluctant to ask for an extension, and it's because they've already got that sense that the university will assume that they're just making up excuses, and they don't want to be seen in that way. And many students also think that asking for support will be seen as a sign of weakness. So rather than be seen as deceitful and weak, they just don't apply for an extension. There's another problem. Universities are generally not consistent in applying late penalties. And I'll give you an example. From time to time, they apply universal temporary late penalty amnesties, usually in response to disaster events. And we saw this during the COVID pandemic. And here in Australia right now, we're seeing it following disaster events like floods. These amnesties mean that a student will be granted an extension if they say that they were impacted by the event, but they don't have to prove that they were impacted. The problem is the amnesty is not offered to students who are impacted by any non-en masse events. So students who are ill, who are going through a tough time, say a family crisis or problems at work, things like that, they have to still prove that these things are happening and impacting them. But there's no reason to believe that those students are any less truthful or in any less need of support than the other students who are just saying that they're impacted by this disaster event. It looks as though universities just use those amnesties to show that they're caring and compassionate at those times. But during those amnesties, they're still as distrusting of students who are impacted by personal problems. And once the amnesty is over, they go back to distrusting all students alike. But hey, surely we should be cautious about handing out extensions willy-nilly, because handing work in on time is really important. But is it? And students who get extensions are gaining a substantial academic advantage over other students. But are they? Why is it important students submit their work on time? Well, one reason is an administrative one. Universities have certain reporting requirements that mean that they have to record how many students are enrolled on their courses and how many students go on to complete their studies. And that means that student work has to be marked by a certain date so that their progress can be reported upon accurately. But this requirement would only really justify the imposition of penalties for work that's very late, many weeks late, rather than just days late. And most students hand their work in days late, not many, many weeks late. So it's not really an issue there. But another administrative issue is tied to staff workloads. It becomes difficult for staff to manage their workloads if their marking doesn't all come in on the same day. And it increases the time that lecturers spend on their marking if you can't do it all in one go. You have to keep refamiliarizing yourself with the assessment and with the marking criteria each time a new piece of work comes in. And it's also harder to maintain consistency in your marking if there are gaps in time between you marking scripts. But these things can be managed. You could batch all of your late work together. It doesn't have to be a big administrative problem. But the university might then say, okay, it's not an administrative issue, or it's not just an administrative issue, it's an equity issue. It's so that no student gets an unfair advantage. But is that true? Well, kind of. If the assessment is, say, a quiz, and a student submits their work after the answers to the quiz have been released. But there are ways you can address that. These days, textbooks, the publishers of textbooks, provide tutors with vast question banks which they can use to create multiple tests, such that no student sits the same test, and that removes that problem. But in any case, this problem is only really a problem for quiz or quiz-like assessments. Not all assessments are quizzes, but all assessments are subjected to late penalties. But maybe a student gains an advantage by having a few more days to work on their assessment, but that's not a good reason for late penalties. Students who need an extension are not getting more time, they're asking for an extension to get enough time. Not all students have the same amount of time available to them to complete their studies, and that's why some students submit their work early, some students submit their work late. Anyway, students are not getting a huge amount of extra time when they submit work late. If they submit their work 1 week late, that's typically only a handful of hours extra that they're getting. It's not like literally 168 hours. It's more like 4 or 5 hours at best, because they've got other study to do, as well as work commitments, family commitments, and so on. I mean, that's why they're asking for an extension, because they haven't got enough time. They just want enough time to complete their work. But the university might then say, well, we use late penalties to prepare students for professional work environments where they have to work to deadlines. Well, no, it's not. If that were the reason, it would be included in all the learning outcomes for every unit the student takes. And tutors would be giving marks for timekeeping, good timekeeping, but they don't. They take marks away for poor timekeeping. And teaching is based on an award system, not a penalty system. When you take marks away from students, you're penalizing a student, you're not teaching a student. Late penalties have absolutely nothing to do with teaching students a skill. But also, in professional work environments, people are typically motivated to get work in by a deadline for reasons other than avoiding punishment. If you've got a report to submit, you aren't faced with a person receiving the report telling you that they're going to impose a 5% penalty on how they judge the quality of your report for every day that it's late. That wouldn't make any sense at all. Typically, they either accept your report or they don't. And if it's a deadline from an external organisation, say for a funding proposal, and you miss the deadline, that's usually it, game over. Your application won't be considered. If it's an internal deadline set by your organisation and you miss it, well, if you keep missing those deadlines, you might end up having your line manager having a chat with you about your work performance. You might get performance managed, and if you don't up your game, well, you could get the sack. Mostly people are motivated, though, through some sense of loyalty and obligation to the team that they're working with. They're committed to their team, they're committed to the other people that they're working alongside, and that's what motivates people to get their work in by deadlines. People aren't motivated by penalty systems. The late penalty systems that we operate in universities don't go anywhere near to reflecting the types of actual deadlines students will face in a professional setting. They don't go anywhere near to mimicking the consequences of missing those deadlines. The deadline system we mimic is kind of like the one operated by financial systems, like banks and so on, and credit card companies. You know, where if you're late with paying your credit card bill, you have to pay a percentage extra in interest. You know, that's the kind of penalty system that we operate with for late work at university. It's not the sort of penalty system you'd ordinarily find in professional work environments. So all of that's a nonsense. Well, that's what I think. Now, there is the thing that employers do typically want people to work to deadlines. They want to recruit staff who can work to deadlines. And typically they'll ask that in a job interview. They'll ask you, you know, are you good at working to deadlines? Can you work under pressure? So, okay, you could say that the penalty system might be imperfect, but at least it gives us a means to keep a check on students who do and don't hand their work in on time. But it doesn't even do that. Most universities don't actually record on students' academic records whether the student handed their work in late. Once the late penalty is applied and the grade is certified, the detail on there being a late penalty that's been applied to that grade gets lost. Only the final grade appears, and you wouldn't know that there'd been any late penalties applied to that grade. This is particularly bad because a student who receives a mark of, say, 90% for their work, which is exceptional, you know, the work is of exceptional quality, it's quite a brilliant student, so they get 90%, but they handed their work in 5 days late and they didn't apply for an extension. They would receive a mark of 65% because they would have 25 marks deducted, 5% per day. So they've gone from 90% down to 65%. 65% is kind of seen as quite an average type of grade. All that appears on that student's record is the 65% grade. It looks as though they'd produced work of average quality, where actually their work was brilliant. But that doesn't get shown in their transcript. So those are the reasons why I think that the way we impose late penalties in universities is stupid. We lower students' grades in ways that just aren't fair. But it's also needless. Students are already getting penalised in other ways when they submit their work late. When you hand in late, your work can get marked late, so you don't get your grade back as quickly as other students get their grade back. And you might not get your marks back in time for it to help you with your next assignment. Or if it's the final assignment, the work might have to be marked quite quickly by the lecturer so that the lecturer can meet their deadline for getting grades submitted to an exam board. And that might mean that you get your grade, but the marker has to skip a bit with the qualitative feedback, so you don't get very much qualitative feedback. Maybe you don't get any at all. Also, if a student keeps handing in their work late for no good reason, they're not going to get a smashing personal reference from their tutor. They're going to struggle to get a tutor to give them a reference. So there are penalties that are there already. We don't need to pile on with extra penalties. So, all in all, I think we need to scrap late penalties. So I've given lots of reasons why, but really it all boils down to one simple thing. And that's the fact that some of us lecturers, like me, actually probably a lot of us, we want to assess our students on the quality of their work. And we want to give our students grades that reflect the quality of their work. We don't want to grade on the basis of the speed at which our students are able to complete their work. And we don't want brilliant work to go unrecognized just because it came in a bit late. Okay, that's all for now. I'm late for my next appointment. So, till next time, ta-da.